Hello there. Want to shift gears a bit today. Want to talk about some canon issues. I'm going to be doing a handful of videos in the coming days and weeks about particularly the canon of the New Testament. And I've talked to more than a few people, even now in the year 2010, who say, well, what about all those other Gospels? What about the Gnostic documents? Why aren't these in the Bible? So I entitled this "The Gospel of Thomas: Better Late Than Never." I want to break down the arguments why the Gospel of Thomas. That's pretty much all the radical scholars' favorite gospel, as far as being written early. And I think Elaine Pagels will say it was written around 50 A.D. A lot of people say no later than 80. I just want to break down the issues with that as far as giving it an early dating. Let's take a gander. Here are some serious problems with the idea of the Gospel of Thomas being written early. First off, you have Thomas, well, quote-unquote Thomas, in that Gospel. It relies much on the New Testament. He quotes the Gospels. He quotes the Pauline epistles. A lot of New Testament sayings are just interlaced throughout the Gospel of Thomas. Now, sit down and read 1 Clement or any of Ignatius of Antioch's 7 epistles. You got Clement was written around 95, Ignatius around 107. You're going to see some passing reference to New Testament texts, but not frequent back and forth in and out quoting them. You just don't. You don't run into frequent New Testament quoting until Polycarp's epistles, which was written around 130. Those books just weren't distributed widely enough at that point. And yet Thomas quotes it left, right, up and down, in and out, and shows familiarity with about 15 New Testament books. And you're supposed to tell me that his gospel was written somewhere between 50 and 90? Number 2, which gospel would you say was written first? Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Most scholars would say it's Mark. Now, Mark's sayings of Jesus and his gospel are written in pretty coarse, rough Greek. In Matthew and Luke, they polish those sayings better in their gospels. And here's the thing: Thomas uses the sayings in his gospel that were the polished Matthew and Luke sayings, not the earlier, coarse Mark sayings. Here's one that if we can prove this definitely, and I think we can prove it pretty reasonably, will pretty much toast the idea that Thomas was written, in the first century. Anybody ever heard of the Diatessaron? No? You haven't? Really? Here's what it was. The Gospels were really originally written in Greek. They weren't translated into Syriac, a different form of Aramaic, until Justin Martyr's disciple Tatian did in around 175. Here's the thing: he didn't translate them individually. He harmonized them all together in a single document called the Diatessaron, which means through the four. Now, if he blended the sayings when he blended the sayings of the four Gospels together and translated them into Syriac, Tatian created some new forms of those sayings. Guess what? Those particular forms, which I emphasize, those forms did not exist until 175 AD, show up in the Gospel of Thomas. So that's a pretty damning piece of evidence that the person who was writing the Gospel of Thomas heisted those sayings from the Diatessaron and put them into his own document. Number 4, where were the Thomasine Christians? If St. Thomas really did, if he really spread this version of the gospel to people and their brand of Christianity didn't match up to the brand preached by Peter or Paul or John, where were they? There were no mention of them in, being critiqued by any of the church fathers, telling believers to stay away from their heretical poison. Again, read Ignatius. He slams the Docetists, who deny Jesus came in the flesh left and right. Irenaeus pimp slaps all kinds of heretical fringe groups in his 5 books called Against Heresies. There's no mention of Christians who claim to follow the teaching of Thomas. And lastly, well, this isn't lastly, this is the last logical point I want you to consider concerning the late date of Thomas: Marcion. Now, who's Marcion? He was a Gnostic heretic from around the middle of the 2nd century. he was of the opinion that the apostles misunderstood the message of Jesus and that only certain books should be read by Christians as Scripture, and that they should be regarded as canonical. He mentioned a good number of Paul's epistles. He mentioned Luke's gospel when he excluded the other three gospels. So if Thomas was written in, say, the 50s or even the 80s or the 90s and had very Gnostic-friendly themes, why wouldn't a Gnostic from the 150s, over nearly 100 years later, not include it in his canon? That's a pretty strong indicator that Thomas didn't exist in Marcion's time. And lastly, and this is kind of this is more of an emotional appeal, so you'll have to excuse me, but I kind of prefer a Jesus who encourages giving to the poor, not discourages it. Here's what he says in saying 14 of the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said to them, "If you will fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves, and if you pray, you will be condemned. If you give to charity, you will harm your spirits." It's kind of a good thing Christians over the centuries haven't believed that, or whether we agree with the message of Christianity or not, the world would be in a much worse off place. So yeah, that's issue number one. You know, why things like the Gospel of Thomas are not included in the New Testament canon. There's just no credible evidence that they can be traced to the first century, let alone to the Apostle Thomas himself. So that's it for the day. We'll hit you next time when we talk about, isn't the whole concept of the canon, isn't that something just decided by the Catholic Church? So we'll talk about that tomorrow, okay? Well, not tomorrow, but soon.